Hello, I'm Casey Mulqueen, Director of Research and Development at TRACOM.
And I'm Natalie Wolfson, Organizational Research Consultant at TRACOM. Casey, I want to ask you about TRACOM's social style norms.
Sure, Natalie, I'm happy to answer those questions.
So, what are norms?
Well, norms is just a shortened term for normative scores, and it's simply a reference point that we create so that people can compare themselves to others. As an example of that, norms make it possible for an analytical style person to understand that she is more controlled in how she displays emotions than an amiable style person, but is very similar in her assertive behavior.
Oh, so it's a lot like standardized tests that school kids take.
That's right. So kids take those tests, and their results are presented as percentiles. If a child scores the 70th percentile, it means he scored better than 70% of students who took the same test. And here at TRACOM, we develop our social style and versatility norms in a very similar way.
Why is it important to develop norms for style and versatility?
Well, first, all countries have unique cultures. France is different from Japan. By creating norms, we can determine whether these cultural differences are reflected in human behavior, and I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes.
That makes sense, and I suppose people want to be compared to others in their own culture. An Italian person wants to be compared to her own culture, not the norms of the United States. And how are norms created?
Well, to create norms for a country, we look at all of the data from that country that we have in our database. And statistically, we divide that data into quartiles, 4 equal parts. For assertiveness, the D category is all scores falling into the 25% of people who are most ask assertive. The C category contains all scores that are less ask assertive than 25% of the people, but more ask assertive than 50% of people. The B category are scores more tell assertive than 50% of people, but less tell assertive than 25% of people. And finally, the A category contains scores that are more tell assertive than 75% of people.
So responsiveness is normed in exactly the same way, with the most emotionally controlled people falling in the 1 category, and the most emoting people falling in the 4 category.
That's right, and though we don't display it here, versatility is normed the same way, falling into the W category at the lower end and Z at the higher end. So to generate an individual's profile, the person's scores on assertiveness and responsiveness are compared to the specific country norm, and the person's social style position is determined.
This means that the number of countries with norms is constantly expanding, right?
That's right, it is. And when a particular country norm is not available, people can default to regional norms. Regional norms are just a combination of data from all countries within a geographic region. For example, the Western Europe norm is composed of data from Germany, France, Austria, Belgium, and several other countries. If an Austrian norm doesn't exist, individuals can choose this regional norm.
So how different are countries then?
Well, as I mentioned before, every country has a unique culture, and this is one of the reasons why people are so eager to have country-specific norms. The question is, to what extent is human behavior influenced by the cultures that we were raised in? Our research on global norms helps to answer this question. What you see here is the average score on assertiveness and responsiveness for a variety of countries throughout the world. The scale on the bottom of the screen represents assertiveness, and the scale on the left represents responsiveness. The scale values are the actual choices from the questionnaire that individuals complete. This ranges from strongly disagree to strongly agree. To create norms, we convert these to numeric values ranging from 1 to 5.
It looks like these countries are all grouped together near the middle of the scale.
That's right, and that's because the averages for these countries are very similar and are near the middle of the scale on both assertiveness and responsiveness. In fact, they're so close to one another that it's impossible to distinguish the countries from one another. So let's zoom in for a closer look. Here we have the same countries but showing very discrete differences. We're now looking at differences in the 1/100th level of detail, which is the level of detail we use to create norms.
And now we can see the differences across countries. Does this show differences in social style?
That's a great question, Natalie. Those blue borders that you see are strictly for convenience to provide a reference point. These are not style borders. Remember, these country positions are only the averages for all data within a country. They do not represent specific social styles.
This is a lot of information. Let's look at one geographic region.
Sure. Let's look at Asia Pacific. One of the most extreme differences is between Japan and China. On average, Japan is much more ask-assertive than China, which happens to have one of the most tell-assertive averages of all countries. And Japan has one of the most ask-assertive averages.
It's almost a half a point difference. So what does this mean?
Well, a very important point I want to make is that by no means does this mean that every person from Japan is ask-assertive, either amiable or analytical, nor is every Chinese person tell-assertive, either driving or expressive. It simply means that, on average, there are differences in assertiveness. Every style is present in every country.
So if I were traveling and working in these two countries, I would expect that in China, more directive and tell-assertive behaviors would be more prominent. And in Japan, I would expect that ask-assertive behaviors would be more common.
Exactly. There's a difference in behavioral norms, which is exactly what we would expect and is the reason why we do this type of research. Let's take a look at Europe.
Very interesting. And look how different Norway and Poland are on the assertiveness scale, and even slightly on responsiveness.
That's right. Poland is more controlled responsive than Norway. And just briefly, here are the countries for North and South America.
Can we see an example of how this actually works with people? How do these norms affect people's profile results?
Sure. So let's take a look at the average scores for the Netherlands and the United States. They're pretty similar on responsiveness, but the Netherlands is more tell-assertive than the U.S. So we took a group of Dutch people and we scored them using U.S. norms. Instead of names, we assigned a number for each person. And this is what the distribution looks like.
Oh, I see. 50% of the people scored as tell-assertive and 50% as ask-assertive.
That's right. So when we reprofiled this group using the Dutch norm, it caused quite a bit of rearrangement for these individuals. That's because the U.S. is more ask-assertive on average than Holland.
Oh, I see. Since the Dutch norm is more tell-assertive, many people moved to the left and profiled as analytical and amiable. 4 of the 6 people who were previously tell-assertive reprofiled as ask-assertive.
That's right, and some of the people also had slight changes on the responsiveness dimension. So as you can see, using country-specific norms can have a meaningful influence on individuals' profile results.
So to summarize, norms are important. Although the differences across countries are small, some of these differences are meaningful and can have an important influence on individuals' profile results.
That's right. It's also important to know that behavioral patterns are consistent across countries, and we see this reflected in the norms. What that means is that the full range of assertiveness and responsiveness is seen in all countries. TRACOM continually develops norms. Over time, we'll develop norms for all countries that have sufficient data. Thank you for your time. For further information, please visit tracom.com.